Okay, well, I know our attendance is way down this morning, but I wanted to go ahead and get started because I'm going to still put this on tape, and that way people can access it at their own inclination. So maybe it'll be a private lesson, who knows? Well, maybe that's why you're here. These last couple weeks, we've kind of had the pedal to the metal. And I'm not going to say it's not going to continue, but I think we'll slow the frenetic pace down a little bit today as we work our way into John chapter 15 now. This will be the second chapter of Jesus' farewell address. And there we go. Let's quickly hit some of the highlights from the last couple of weeks that we've been noticing out of chapter 14, which, as you recall, we said was sort of John's first draft of this evening, and then he comes back probably at some later time and records chapters 15 and 16 with greater detail. But you'll recall that chapter 14 followed on the heels of the Passover evening that he and his disciples were spending together. It began with that Passover meal, which of course was a great celebration, the pinnacle of the Jewish calendar, and it celebrated their spiritual and national heritage. And Jesus, during that meal, had claimed to be the very fulfillment of that event, of that historic event that Israel continued to celebrate. And he repurposed that meal into one that would now celebrate him and what he was doing for all of mankind as he instituted the Lord's Supper. Now, John doesn't give us any of that detail, but we know that that's what was occurring during that meal. And then John tells us that during that meal, Jesus got up from the table, interrupted things, in order to teach them the lesson of foot washing and the lesson of humility, and the message was one of sacrifice and service. Jesus went on to announce that one of them would commit treason against him, and that had to be just a hard thing for them to hear, a tremendously difficult thing for them to hear because of the way that they had grown to be together and to be dependent upon one another. Later, Jesus dismissed Judas from the room to go ahead and do what he had planned to do. Jesus told them that evening that he would be leaving and that they would not be able to follow. But then he sort of amended that. He said to Peter, "You will follow, but you'll follow later. At a later time, you'll be able to follow where I'm going." Jesus also foresaw Peter's weakness and told him that before this night ends, you're going to deny me 3 times. Understandably, by the end of this time, and as Jesus starts to talk to them in chapter 14, these guys had to be very shook up, very confused, probably very discouraged, and maybe even angry about where they found themselves right now. And so as we get to chapter 14, which was what we're reviewing, Jesus began to talk to those 11 who would ultimately change the world, but at this moment weren't in a very good place. And they couldn't be. They couldn't feel confident. They couldn't feel competent. And how in the world is this going to go on if Jesus is actually leaving us? And so in chapter 14, we'll quickly run through this. What Jesus has already told them now is, first of all, he gave them a message of comfort and reassurance. And he said, it's for your good that I'm going away. I'm going to prepare a place to take you to so that we can all be together again. And he promises then that he will eventually bring them along with him. And then Jesus includes a message of great encouragement to these disciples as he tells them they already know more than they realize, okay? They're in a better place than they think they are. They have had the benefit and the privilege of being with Jesus intimately for 3 to 4 years now. And so that has given them great insight into what Jesus was all about and what his Father is intending for Jesus. And so as they've watched Jesus, they've really been seeing his Father. And that's the thing that Jesus emphasizes to them. And then Jesus begins to speak of this new order, what things will be like when he's actually gone. And he tells them that his work is going to continue. Yes, it'll seem a little different, and Jesus being in heaven will actually benefit the work and make it more effective rather than less effective. And they will be still linked to Jesus. The linkage from earth to heaven will be through the vehicle of prayer, and the linkage from heaven to earth will be through this new paraclete or helper for the disciples, the Holy Spirit, in the way that he would provide assistance to them. And then Jesus went on to identify himself with that paraclete. And this was one of the real keys of chapter 14, this transition that's going to occur with Jesus living with them in their presence now as a physical helper, but that's going to give way to a spiritual helper who will live not with them, but in them. And so that will be the transition that's going to occur in the new order, in the new system. And then we talked, Jesus brings these three different tracks and brings them together. And these three tracks, these three different ideas, are those of love, of obedience, and of fellowship. And for love, it's the love by Jesus and by the Father for his disciples, but also the inverse of that, the love of the disciples for Jesus and for his Father. And then the obedience that he talks about is the obedience to Jesus and to his Father. And then the fellowship that they talk about is this indwelling. And the indwelling that we talked about was, first of all, in the Holy Spirit would live in them, but also Jesus is pretty specific. He says, we, meaning he and his Father, will come and live in you too. And so there's this great indwelling blessing and promise that's given to them. And then towards the end of the chapter, we saw this moment where Jesus sort of summarizes where things have gotten to. He reminds them that the spiritual paraclete will continue to be with them, will inform them, will teach them. He will help them remember what Jesus had said when he was here on earth. He'll help them understand what Jesus had said when he was here on earth, because they didn't understand a lot of it. But then also he will reveal some new things as they are planning the direction of the future. Okay? And then Jesus gives his farewell greeting, the shalom, all right? And that was in verse 27. And Jesus wishes them peace. But Jesus takes that wish for peace, which is what the world routinely does in greeting one another, and that was common in Israel then, and it's still common today, is just wishing good events and wishing for peace in the future. But Jesus says, I don't give this as the world gives it, and he's actually giving them a promise of his peace. Okay? And so there's a nuance there that's important in what Jesus is providing to them. It's not just a wish for peace, but he's actually giving them a peace. And then he gives this final big picture status report. He reminds them that their time is short, that Satan is right there on the doorstep. And this is a reminder to them of the great spiritual battle that is about to be decisively decided. And that will happen very, very soon right here. He tells them, Satan has no power over me. But the reason I'm going to go through with this is because the world must see how I love and obey my Father. I do exactly what he commands. And then Jesus closes it out with this, come now, let's leave. And in saying that, it's kind of like, okay, bring it. It's on. The game is afoot. This is happening right now. Let's enter the arena. Let's do this. And that's where Jesus is at as we end chapter 14. So now we come to chapter 15. Excuse me. And these two chapters, as we've said, are sort of a replay of chapter 14, but we get additional details and additional applications brought into the text here. These two chapters, you kind of have to take them together. they divide into three sections. The first section is a section that talks about the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the disciples. And initially, anyhow, Jesus puts that in the context of a vine with branches and bearing fruit. Okay, that's an analogy that we'll get into, but you're very familiar with it, I'm sure. And then the second section that we're going to encounter will be Jesus talks to them about what it's going to be like living in the world. Okay? And part of the message here is that the first section about the relationships is going to be a relationship of love, is where Jesus is going to take that discussion. And he sort of says, you better find your love here because you're not going to find it in the world. The world is not going to love you. So you are going to have to rely on one another. And then the third thing that Jesus is going to talk to them about is the fact that their temporary sorrow is going to be transformed into great, deep, and abiding joy. So we're going to start with this first topic, and if we can get through this today, that'll be great. So Jesus speaks first about their ongoing relationship. And as he begins to talk, he talks about, as we said before, he talks about their relationship in terms of a vine in God's vineyard. This is it's about as close as John gets to a parable. Most of the typical all of the typical parables that we read about in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not recorded in John. The other closely almost parable that we had in John was when Jesus was talking back in chapter 10 about the sheep and the sheepfold and the good shepherd. That was the only other time that Jesus really speaks in terms of speaks through a parable in this gospel. Now, this parable is not an allegory. And what that means is every little thing about this comparison doesn't have meaning, okay? You have to just restrict yourself to getting the big picture from the analogy that Jesus uses. So we focus on the main ideas of this comparison and not every little tiny detail. The Jews were very familiar with the use of vines and speaking about vines in the scriptures because it's all over the Old Testament. And in that context, the vine or the vineyard throughout the Old Testament was used to refer usually or almost always to Israel, to the physical nation of Israel. And we're going to actually look at some examples here of texts in the Old Testament that speak about a vine and a vineyard. And then what I want for you to do is be listening as we go through this because I want for us to compare the way that vines and vineyards are described and used in the Old Testament versus what Jesus is saying now in John chapter 15. All right, so let's take a look first at, we're going to go to Psalms chapter 80 and verses 8 through 16. And we're just going to read this to get an idea of what we're talking about here in the Old Testament context of what vines and vineyards meant. The reason this is important is because when Jesus tells these disciples in John 15 about being vines and vineyards, we need to understand what their understanding already was of this situation and what they would be taking it to mean and how they would interpret it. Okay, so Psalm 80. This is a psalm of Asaph. So Asaph said this: "You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it." So, of course, he's referring to the nation of Israel. "You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, and the mighty cedars with its branches. It sent out its boughs to the sea, and its shoots as far as the river, so that all who pass by pick its..." I'm sorry, I skipped a phrase. Starting in verse 12. "Why have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass by pick its grapes? The boars from the forest ravage it, and the creatures of the field feed on it. Return to us, O Lord God Almighty. Look down from heaven and see. Watch over this vine, the root your right hand has planted, the son you have raised up for yourself. Your vine is cut down, it's burned with fire, and at your rebuke, your people perish. That's what this psalm had to say about vines and vineyards, of course referring to the nation of Israel. Now, turn over to Isaiah chapter 5. And this time we'll read verses 1 through 7. As again, we hear the prophet speak of the vine, the vineyard. Isaiah writes, I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up, cleared it of stones, and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. And then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now, you dwellers in Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? And now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I'll take away its hedge, and its wall will be destroyed. I'll break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I'll make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there, and I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, and for righteousness, but heard only cries of distress. Again, a picture is being created of Israel's relationship to God. And then there's just a single verse over in Jeremiah that I want you to see. This is Jeremiah chapter 2. Verse 21, Jeremiah the prophet says, I had planted you like a choice vine of sound and reliable stock. How then did you turn against me into a corrupt and wild vine? Okay? Now we're not going to read the next one. I'm going to give it to you though so you can read it on your own. That's the chapter because it's the whole chapter. This is Ezekiel 17. In Ezekiel 17, the first 10 verses again speak of God's relationship with his nation of Israel. And basically it gives the history of foreign kings coming in. They're described as eagles coming and carrying away part of the branch that had been broken off. And so like kings like Nebuchadnezzar are described as these eagles that would come in and cart off the children of Israel into captivity. So that's the message of Ezekiel. And then Ezekiel, after describing presenting the vision or the allegory, he describes what its interpretation is in the middle of this chapter. But towards the end of the chapter, he gives a messianic thrust to it. And that's the only little piece I want to read to you from Ezekiel 17. You should read the entire chapter because there's a lot there. But in the sake of saving time, I just want to read from verse 22 through the end of the chapter and listen to how this portends what's coming in the future. This is what the sovereign Lord says, writes Ezekiel. I myself will take a shoot from the very top of a cedar and plant it. I will break off a tender sprig from its topmost shoots and plant it on a high and lofty mountain, and on the mountain heights of Israel I will plant it. It will produce branches and bear fruit and become a splendid cedar. Birds of every kind will nest in it, and they will find shelter in the shade of its branches. All the trees of the field will know that I, the Lord, bring down the tall tree and make the low tree grow tall. I dry up the green tree and make the dry tree flourish. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will do it. And now Jesus comes along, chapter 15. Oops, I got behind again. There we go. Jesus comes along in chapter 15 and uses a similar analogy, but I think as we start to look at it, we're going to see the application is very, very different. And notice how he starts out. He starts out with this phrase in chapter 1, chapter 15, verse 1, and Jesus says, I am the true vine. And right there he says, what you've learned about the vine in the past isn't really the truth. That's not the fulfillment of this thing. I'm going to now give you the rest of the story, okay? And that's where Jesus is going to go with this. This is a very familiar text, but before we go into it, I just want to review a couple of points that I'm sure you're familiar with. First of all, what's God's role in this garden in John 15? All right, the NIV translates it gardener. There's a little bit that's missing from that translation, though. It really should be husbandman or even the owner of the vineyard, because this is Jesus is not saying my Father is the hired person that comes in and does his work in the garden and goes home. That's not what Jesus is talking about. The word that's used is that of being a husbandman or the caretaker of the garden. He's the one that is fully responsible for what's going on in that garden. It was his plan in the beginning, and it will be measured against his goals and his objectives and what he wants that garden to become. So it's really more than a gardener, and that was the point I wanted to make about this, is that that's a bit of a weak word when we read the word gardener. I think of just a day laborer or an hourly laborer that comes in and does their work and goes home. That's not what's being depicted here at all. Okay, what is Jesus' position in the garden? He's the vine, okay? And then what are the disciples in the garden, according to verse 8? Did I say verse 8? It should be verse 5. Sorry about that. They're the branches. Yeah, the disciples are the branches. I'm sorry, I sent you to the wrong text, part of the text. So, yeah, with that understanding now, we're going to read the text. And again, I want for you to think about what Jesus is describing in comparison to what they have already been exposed to through the Old Testament prophets. So let's read 1 through 8. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he's like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. In verse 1, Jesus establishes the roles in the garden. We've already spoken of that. Verse 2, he begins to describe the disciplinary process and how things are going to work. What's the criteria that's going to be used for evaluating the quality of these branches? Fruit bearing. Are you bearing fruit or not? And this means both productivity, bearing fruit and bearing lots of it, and quality, because he said in there, the reason that the Father prunes is to make you even more fruitful. So quality is important here as well. There's been a lot of discussions about what this fruit represents historically in the churches, and usually it boils down to arguments between, well, are we talking about the winning of souls, or are we talking about the development of Christian character and Christian qualities in one's life? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes, because both have to be involved. Remember what Jesus said over in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, by their fruits you will know them. So fruits are that which establish who we belong to. The fruit is that which happens in our lives or which we demonstrate to others, and that includes both those whom we influence for Christ as well as the character of our own lives, because that's what do people see when they look at a disciple? Do they see the fruit that demonstrates who they really belong to? Okay? Also in verse 2, what happens to branches that do not bear fruit? Verse 2 says they're cut off. Verse 6 says they're thrown away, at which time they wither and then they're burnt. Okay? What happens to the branches that do bear fruit? And how do they get incented to bear more fruit? The Father still tweaks them. He prunes them too. So the point is, who gets away easy? Who gets away untouched? Nobody. Nobody gets untouched. God's discipline and His shaping are for everybody. Nobody gets away untouched. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but I want for you to put, if you're taking any notes, put a note down to read Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11. Because there the Hebrew writer speaks of God's discipline. And he speaks of the fact that children understand and know that the discipline their father brings is for their good, for their development, for their growth. And in fact, in verse 7 of Hebrews chapter 12, the writer said, endure hardship as discipline. So that's the tweaking. That's the tweaking. That's the pruning that John is talking about, that Jesus is talking about back in John chapter 15. It includes the hardships that God allows to be present in our lives. Okay, verse 3 of John 15. Jesus said, you're already clean. Now, where does clean come from in this context? He hasn't been talking about clean, has he? Or has he? Well, the answer is yes, but we don't see it in the English translation. The reason he can talk about clean is because when Jesus said in verse 2, he cuts off every branch that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes. That word also means cleans. Okay? So if you substitute cleans in there, now you can understand what verse 3 is saying. So let's take a look at that. The Father cuts off every branch in me, in Jesus, that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he cleans so that it will even be more fruitful. You are already clean. Now, does that mean they were perfect? No. But they were undergoing the discipline and the direction and the course correction that the Father had intended for them to undergo. And so what Jesus had been teaching them had the same effect that this pruning and this cleansing was going to do throughout the future and in our lives just as well. Okay? So it's not that they were perfect, but it's putting them in a position where they could be fruitful. All right? Verses 4 through 7, there's another phrase that begins to show up over and over and over again, and it's the phrase, remain in me. And we have to think about that in context of this vine. When Jesus says, you're to remain in me, that means to stay in the vine. Don't be going off by yourself, because you won't be fruitful in that scenario. You won't be bearing the right kind of fruit for sure. But he speaks of remaining in me. And the analogy there is obvious. If you become disconnected from the vine, your death is just a matter of time. And there's no way that you can avoid that. Verse 7 sounds like a couple of different places we looked at last week, where Jesus says, ask whatever you wish and it will be given you. Well, he's not just giving them carte blanche, as we discussed last week. That has to be governed by what he said in the first part of the verse, where he said, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, then the Father will give you your request. But that's saying that your request will be consistent with what Jesus would be requesting and expecting also. Okay. The final verse that we read, verse 8, gives the glory back to God the Father. And he says finally that fruit bearing is the way that you will demonstrate that you are really disciples. Now, think about the word disciple. It's closely related, obviously, to the word discipline. What is a disciple? A disciple is one that has learned a discipline. In this case, it's the discipline of Christ. It's the discipline of being what Jesus wants and expects us to be. Okay, so having said that, now let's go back to the place where we started. Let's compare now this depiction of this garden and this vine to what we read about in the Old Testament. What are some of the similarities that we see between what we read about in the Old Testament and what we read in the New Testament? Can you think of anything similar? Good. Yeah, there's this, the important character in the whole thing is God. And he's the one that determines everything, as it turns out. And so, yes, the first thing that we see is God's role in both vineyards, okay? And he is the ultimate responsibility. But it also speaks of the accountability that people have before God. In the Old Testament, that was the accountability of Israel. In the New Testament, it's the accountability of individual disciples, right? Okay. So, the other part of the question, what then are the differences that we see between what was talked about by the prophets and what Jesus says? What's different when Jesus says, I'm the true vine? What's different here? Well, let me suggest, I've got 3 ideas for you. First of all is the divine presence. In the Old Testament, it seems like God is watching over the garden, but kind of from a distance. He's watching over it. He's going to judge it. He still has an interest in what that garden is doing, but he seems distant. Okay? In the New Testament, there is almost no distance from the branch to the vine. They are connected right to each other. You are right next to Jesus in this picture, in this word picture. You are connected to Jesus in this word picture. And so Jesus is the true vine because he indwells the organism. He indwells, he lives in the plant. You don't see that in the Old Testament. This is different. The presence of Jesus. Okay? Next, what about the relationship? Well, in the Old Testament, Israel was treated as an entity. It was all about Israel's faithfulness and Israel's judgment on the nation, on the group of people. But in the New Testament, the evaluation is being done of individual branches. Each branch gets its own inspector. And that inspector is a good one. And he's going to evaluate what it is that you have and what you need. And each branch has to make an individual decision to be fruitful and to remain in the plant. Okay? So this is very different from what the Old Testament had talked about with the nation of Israel. Now Jesus is saying this is an individual thing. Okay? And then the third thing that I want for you to see out of this is how God's discipline works. In the Old Testament, God's discipline was kind of indirect. Did you notice that? When God wanted to discipline the garden, when he wanted to fix the garden, or when he wanted to give the garden up to its enemies, he just broke down the walls around the garden. Or he asked the clouds, don't rain. Okay? And so the garden would suffer those effects, but not immediately, not directly under the hand of God. God would do something that was indirect in order to emphasize their need for accountability. In the New Testament, the picture is God looking at every one of these branches and sorting it out and making a careful tweak here and a careful tweak there. It's very direct. He's not giving a punishment or a reward for large groups of people. He's doing it branch by branch by branch. Every one of us is getting what I would call a private lesson here. And then the other thing that is involved here is that in the Old Testament, you get the idea that God's discipline is primarily a discipline of judgment. Because they've been so bad, he has to give them up to the wild animals or to the weeds or to the drought or whatever it is. That's been their reward. That's what they've earned. But in the New Testament, as God is inspecting fruit, it's being done out of love. And it's being done out of a discipline that will bring about improvement. And it's intended to communicate the importance of growing and developing. And so, like we said before, every branch is getting a private lesson and gets its own lesson plan for how it needs to develop. So, it's a very, very interesting analogy, isn't it? And the differences, and now you can see why Jesus said, I am the true vine. This is the way it's really intended to be. Okay, so let's summarize. First of all, what I just said, Jesus is the true vine. This is the reality of how God wants to interact with us and interact with people. This is what he's been looking for throughout history. The Old Testament provided us with a model, with a primitive model, but it didn't have all of the nuance that Jesus' relationship will bring. The physical model, which involved the nation of Israel, is going to transition into this spiritual reality, and it's going to be one of intimacy and love rather than distance and judgment. Okay? Secondly, Jesus speaks here about God's care and discipline, okay, as he interacts directly with individuals and as he provides that which is intended for their growth, for their development, for their life, okay? And then the third thing that we see, to summarize, is that Jesus' intention is to send them into their future with both an assignment and a promise. And I want to read verse 8 again and listen to this carefully as Jesus really gives us the intention of why this is all important. Listen to what he says. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Notice the optimism that's there. He's virtually guaranteeing their success if they cooperate with the program. And this is what's going to happen. There will be all kinds of fruit. And what an opportunity that was to be for them and for us. Okay, so Jesus tells this parable, and this is where we're going to end up today. Jesus tells this parable, encouraging us to think about what's it like to be a branch on Jesus' vine, right? And so let's take inventory of ourselves where we are in that plant. First of all, let's look upstream. And as we look upstream, we see that's Jesus. We're looking towards the vine that provides all of our nutrition. Here's some questions. Do I realize that Jesus is living right there, right with me? Is he that close? Do I understand that everything that I need for my existence and for my benefit flows right through him? Do I understand that? Am I doing what is necessary to stay spiritually healthy and remain in him, using his own words? Remain connected to him. Am I doing what I need to do to remain connected to Jesus? Am I content with what he's providing me? Am I willing to remain in him? Or am I looking elsewhere? And if I'm looking elsewhere, what is it that I'm really seeking? What is it that I think is more important than Jesus? That's looking upstream. Now let's look downstream. And we look downstream and we see the grapes, we see the berries, we see the flowers, we see the fruit of our lives. Okay? We look at our fruit. What is the fruit that you have borne and are bearing now for Jesus? Do others in my world recognize me for what I claim to be? What does your fruit say about you? What does my fruit say about me? Do I look more like Jesus today than I did yesterday? What do I intend to look like tomorrow? And if I want to look like that, how do I get there? Because I won't get there accidentally. The Father's going to tweak things so I can get to the place He wants me to be. But do I see that? Do I see that? Is that the kind of fruit that I'm after? Is His fruit? Growth, productivity, fruit bearing, whether you're talking about influencing others or whether you're talking about development of your own Christian character, those are not accidental things. They happen because God has intended it, first of all, and then secondly, you and I have intended to become that kind of a person also. All right, so that's upstream, that's downstream. Now, what about the garden you're living in? What about your world? Am I out of balance? What I mean by that, sometimes we're so focused on being with Jesus that I've forgotten that I need to be bearing fruit. It's all about the experience of being with Jesus. Or sometimes it gets so oriented towards what Jesus can do for me that we get all focused on the fruit and what's happening here and what's happening in my circle instead of thinking about what's God's agenda, what's Jesus intending for me. Am I out of balance in this fruit-bearing exercise? Where's the owner? Where's the caretaker in my life? Can I see situations and times in the past when He has pruned me and washed me to clean me up? Do I see those situations in my past? Do I welcome them and trust them when they're on the horizon and we see them coming now? Do I welcome those experiences, knowing that they will bring me through this thing in a healthier and more productive way than I was before? How will I react in the next trial that God brings to my life? When He's providing an opportunity for discipline, how will I react to that? Am I optimistic about my current state of living, about my faith, about my engagement with God's people, about my engagement with the world around me? Am I optimistic? Or am I living like a sad sack, knowing that God expects something and so I have to do it? Where's our incentive? Where's the joy? Do we recognize what a blessing it has been for us to be living with and in Jesus? Wow. Well, those are the inventories that we need to be looking at as we read this pseudo-parable here. Next week, we're going to take this parable, we're going to move forward, and we're going to talk about how Jesus now begins to speak of this relationship as one that's completely governed by love. And that's where we'll head next week in the next section of John chapter 15. Thank you all for your attendance. I know it's a rough day on the roads and things out there, but it's good to see you all and have you here. Thank you much. And God is good.